The year is 1284, and the world is held in the motionless, silver grip of a winter that has forgotten the concept of spring. We find ourselves in a small, stoutly built stone dwelling nestled high within the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Pyrenees. Outside, the air is not merely cold. It is a physical presence, a heavy, crystalline weight that presses against the thick granite walls of the mountain outpost. It is a silence so profound that it seems to have a sound of its own, a low, humming resonance of frozen earth and dormant stone. Inside, the atmosphere is thick with the scent of aged oak wood, the faint, metallic tang of iron, and the comforting, musk-heavy aroma of thick sheepskin rugs. The dawn has not yet broken, but the sky is beginning to shift from the deep, bruised purple of midnight to a pale, translucent indigo. Through the narrow, slit-like wind, protected by a thick pane of cloudy, hand-blown glass, the frost has begun its slow, geometric conquest. If you were to lean closer, your breath blooming in a soft, white cloud, you would see the intricate patterns of the ice. They are like frozen ferns, delicate and silver, reaching across the glass in slow, unhurried arcs. Each crystal is a masterpiece of unbothered geometry, a tiny, hexagonal world formed by the patient accumulation of moisture meeting the biting chill of the exterior. Underneath a mountain of heavy, hand-woven wool blankets, the warmth of the bed is a sanctuary. The wool is coarse but dependable, colored in the natural grays and creams of the mountain sheep. It carries the weight of many winters, a reassuring pressure that keeps the body anchored to the mattress of straw and dried lavender. The lavender, though long since harvested, still releases a faint, dusty perfume whenever you move, a ghostly memory of a summer meadow, now buried under 6 feet of unblemished snow. The floor of the room is made of wide, dark planks of chestnut wood. They have been polished smooth by the passage of soft leather boots and woolen socks over decades. In the corner, the hearth contains the glowing heart of last night's fire. The embers are a deep, pulsing crimson, draped in a fine, silken coating of gray ash. Occasionally, a single spark will crackle, a small, sharp sound that only emphasizes the deep quiet of the room. It is a sound like a single thread snapping in a tapestry of silence. The warmth from these embers radiates in a slow, invisible wave, barely reaching the edge of the bed, creating a delicate boundary between the pocket of heat and the encroaching, patient cold of the room. On a heavy timber table near the hearth sits a single object of focus, a long sword, unsheathed and resting upon a bed of oiled leather. This is where our journey into the quiet history of metallurgy begins. To the eye of a casual observer, the sword is a static thing, a rigid length of steel, cold and unyielding. But as the temperature outside drops to 30 degrees below freezing, the very nature of this metal is undergoing a subtle, silent transformation. It is a change that occurs at the level of the unseen, in the microscopic architecture of the iron atoms. In the height of summer, or even in the mild dampness of autumn, this blade is a marvel of flexibility. Steel at its core is a dialogue between iron and carbon. The iron provides the body, the mass, the structure. The carbon, nestled in the tiny gaps between the iron atoms, provides the strength. When the weather is temperate, these atoms exist in a state of relative ease. They are capable of shifting ever so slightly when the blade is struck. They can absorb energy, bending like a willow branch before snapping back into their original linear form. This is what the masters call toughness, the ability of a material to deform without breaking. However, as the mercury in an imaginary glass would plummet, the steel begins to lose its conversational grace. The cold acts as a restrictive force, a tightening of the bonds. In the extreme chill of this mountain winter, the atoms of the steel lose their ability to slide past one another. The energy required to move them becomes greater than the energy required to simply snap the bonds between them. This is the transition from a ductile state to a brittle state, a phenomenon known to modern science as the ductile-to-brittle transition temperature, though the smiths of 1284 know it only as the winter's bite. Imagine the sword as a frozen river. In the warmth, the water flows, yielding to the shape of the stones. In the deep winter, it becomes ice, hard, beautiful, but utterly unforgiving. If you were to strike a block of ice with a hammer, it would not dent, it would shatter. And so it is with the sword on the table. The iron atoms, which are arranged in a specific lattice structure, have become locked. In this intense cold, the body-centered cubic structure of the ferritic steel becomes increasingly resistant to the movement of dislocations, the tiny glitches in the crystal lattice that allow metal to bend. The sword, resting there in the dim light, looks the same as it did in July. Its surface is a dull, matte gray, reflecting the faint red glow of the embers, but internally it is becoming more akin to glass or ceramic. The very cold that keeps the snow crisp and the air sharp is turning the weapon into something fragile. It is a quiet irony of history. The tool designed for the greatest of impacts becomes most vulnerable when the environment is at its most harsh. We listen to the house. The stones of the walls are thick, perhaps 3 feet across, hewn from the local limestone. As the cold intensifies outside, the stones contract. Occasionally, a deep, resonant thrum echoes through the structure, the sound of the mountain itself adjusting to the weight of the frost. It is a low-frequency sound, more felt in the chest than heard in the ears. It is the heartbeat of the winter. Near the bed, a small earthenware mug sits on a wooden stool. It contains the remains of a chamomile tea, now long cold. A thin skin of ice has begun to form on its surface, a delicate, translucent veil. This small circle of ice mirrors the vast sheets of ice covering the lakes in the valley below. It is the same process, occurring on different scales. The molecules of water, slowing down, losing their kinetic energy, and finally locking into a rigid crystalline lattice. It is the same slowing down that is happening within the sword, and perhaps the same slowing down that is happening within the mind as it drifts toward sleep. The air in the room is perfectly still. There are no drafts here, for the seams of the windows have been stuffed with dried moss and coated in tallow. The stillness is absolute. You can hear the rhythmic, slow rise and fall of your own breathing. Each breath is a soft, shushing sound, like the distant waves of a calm sea hitting a sandy shore. In and out, the warmth of the breath meets the cool air of the room, creating a tiny, fleeting mist that vanishes almost as soon as it appears. The sword on the table remains the center of our quiet contemplation. It is a type XII according to later scholars, a blade designed for the cut and the thrust, with a wide fuller running down the center to reduce weight. In the summer, That fuller would allow the blade to sing as it moved through the air. Now, in the deep of winter, the blade is silent. It is waiting. If one were to pick it up now, the hilt cold enough to sting the bare palm, and strike it against a frozen log outside, it would not ring with a clear, bell-like tone. It would likely emit a dull, short clack, or worse, it would simply divide in two, the fracture surface looking like granulated sugar, sparkling with the jagged edges of broken crystal. This phenomenon was a silent passenger on many a historical campaign. In the great heathen army's winters or the long marches of the Teutonic Knights, the cold was a third party in every duel. A knight might find his prized possession, forged in the heat of a Mediterranean summer, failing him in the Baltic frost, not because of a flaw in the smith's work, but because of the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. The metal, in its quest for stability in the cold, gives up its ability to be resilient. The embers in the hearth shift. A small piece of charcoal rolls down the side of the mound, landing with a soft thud on the stone floor. It glows brightly for a moment, a tiny sun in the darkness, before slowly fading back to a dusty gray. The light it casts flickers across the sword, highlighting the faint scratches and nicks of past use. Each mark tells a story of a time when the metal was warm and forgiving. Now, those scratches are potential sites for stress concentration. In the brittle cold, a single tiny scratch can become the starting point of a catastrophic crack. We observe the textures of the room again. The rough-hewn stone of the walls, where the tool marks of the mason are still visible, long, rhythmic grooves where the chisel met the rock. The ceiling is made of heavy beams of smoked larch, dark and fragrant. There is a single cobweb in the corner, silvered by the frost, looking like a net of diamonds. It doesn't move. Nothing moves. The world is suspended in a state of crystalline perfection. The weight of the blankets is so comforting now. It feels like a gentle, warm hand pressing down, inviting the muscles to let go of their last remaining tension. The toes, tucked deep within the wool, are finally beginning to glow with warmth. The rhythm of the heart slows, syncing with the slow, patient pulse of the mountain. There is no hurry. The winter will last for many months more. The snow will continue to pile up against the door, a soft, white barricade against the world. The sword will remain on the table, its atoms locked in their cold embrace. It is a piece of history resting in the silence. It is a lesson in the limits of materials and the power of the environment. But for now, it is simply an object in a room, bathed in the dying light of a fire, while the frost continues its slow, beautiful work on the window pane. The geometric ferns grow a fraction of a millimeter longer. The indigo sky turns a shade lighter. The world remains hushed, wrapped in the soft, heavy velvet of a medieval winter night. There is only the warmth of the bed, the smell of the wood smoke, and the profound, hypnotic stillness of the high peaks. As we watch the last glow of the ember, we feel the edges of consciousness begin to soften, much like the edges of the shadows in the room. The transition from wakefulness to sleep is much like the transition of the metal, a slow settling into a different state of being. But where the metal becomes brittle, the mind becomes fluid, drifting away from the rigid structures of the day and into the soft, formless depths of rest. The cold outside only makes the warmth inside feel more profound, more absolute. You are safe. You are warm. The story of the steel is a quiet one, a monotonous one, a a story of atoms and ice, told in the language of shadows and silence. The wind outside gives a long, low sigh, a gentle sound like a flute played from a great distance. It doesn't rattle the shutters, it only brushes past them, a reminder of the vast, cold space of the world beyond these walls. Inside, the peace is undisturbed. The sword rests. The stones hold. The lavender-scented straw cradles you, and the frost continues its slow, intricate dance across the glass, drawing patterns that no one will see until the sun finally climbs over the eastern ridge. But that is hours away. For now, there is only the silence and the slow, steady rhythm of the winter's heart. The transition from the deep, dreamless state of sleep to the first flicker of conscious awareness is a slow and deliberate journey in the winter of 1284. It does not happen with a startle or a sudden realization, but rather as a gradual thinning of the veil of darkness. The first thing you notice is the weight of the air against the tip of your nose, the only part of your body exposed to the room. It is a sharp, biting cold, a stark contrast to the humid, heavy warmth beneath the layers of sheepskin and wool. The air is so still that it feels like a solid substance, a cold jelly that has filled the room while you slept, pressing against the stone walls and the heavy timber door. As you lie there, perfectly motionless, you listen to the house waking up in the cold. There is no sound of birds here, for the songbirds have long since fled to the warmer climes of the southern valleys, leaving only the stoic black ravens who sit like feathered statues on the pine branches outside. Instead, the sounds are internal. There is the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling ember in the hearth, a tiny clink as the carbonized wood contracts. There is the soft, almost imperceptible sigh of the wind as it searches for a gap in the thick masonry, finding none. And then, there is the sound of your own heartbeat, a muffled, steady thud that seems to echo the slow, geological pace of the mountain itself. With a slow, reluctant movement, you reach a hand out from beneath the blankets to test the air. The skin of your hand immediately prickles as the heat dissipates into the room. You find the edge of the heavy chestnut bed frame, the wood feeling as cold and smooth as a river stone. Your fingers trace the grain of the wood, feeling the ridges and valleys left by the carpenter's plane centuries ago. This wood was once a living tree, drinking in the sun of 100 summers. Now, it is a silent sentinel, holding the weight of the sleeper in the heart of the winter. The task of rising is a logistical exercise in the preservation of heat. You slide your feet out first, seeking the thick woolen stockings that were laid out the night before. They are made of a dense, unwashed wool, still containing the natural lanolin of the sheep, which makes them slightly tacky to the touch and remarkably water-resistant. As you pull them on, the coarse fibers tickle the skin, a sensation that is initially sharp but quickly gives way to a spreading, itchy warmth. Then come the leather slippers, lined with rabbit fur, which muffle the sound of your footsteps on the wide floorboards. The floorboards themselves are a marvel of endurance. Each plank is nearly 2 feet wide, cut from the heart of an ancient forest. They have been polished by generations of feet into a deep, honey-colored glow. As you step onto them, they do not creak with a sharp, jarring noise, but rather give a low, resonant groan, a sound of structural satisfaction. You walk slowly toward the hearth, the movement of your body creating a small eddy in the still, cold air. The fire must be reborn. This is a task that requires patience and a focus on the smallest of details. You kneel on the stone hearth, the granite feeling cold even through the layers of wool and fur. Using a small iron poker, you gently disturb the mound of gray ash. Beneath the surface, the embers are still alive, glowing with a fierce, concentrated orange light. They look like a miniature city scene from a great height, a landscape of glowing canyons and dark, ashy peaks. You take a small handful of tinder, dried birch bark that has been shredded into fine paper-like ribbons. It is as light as a moth's wing. You place it carefully over the glow. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, a thin blue thread of smoke begins to rise, twisting in the air like a phantom. It carries the sharp, sweet scent of birch resin. You lean in close, your face feeling the sudden, intense radiation of the heat, and you breathe. Not a sharp blow, but a long, steady, purposeful exhalation. The embers brighten to a brilliant yellow, and the birch bark curls, blackens, and then suddenly bursts into a tiny, joyful flame. This small flame is the beginning of the day's warmth. You add small twigs of pine, their needles crackling as the sap inside them expands and explodes in microscopic pops. The sound is like a distant, miniature firework display. The smell of pine fills the room, a clean, medicinal aroma that cuts through the mustiness of the old stone. Slowly, you add larger pieces of split oak, stacking them in a precise, lean-to structure that allows the air to circulate. The fire grows, its light dancing across the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that make the room feel as though it is breathing. Now your attention returns to the sword on the table. In the growing light of the fire, the steel takes on a different character. You pick it up, and the cold of the metal is so intense that it almost feels hot, a paradoxical sensation known as cold burn. The hilt is wrapped in fine silver wire, intertwined with dark, oil-hardened leather. The wire provides a grip that is both firm and intricate, the tiny twists of metal pressing into the pads of your fingers. This sword is more than a weapon. It is a complex chemical system. To understand why it might break in this cold, we must look at the process of its creation. When the smith forged this blade, he heated the iron until it glowed with the color of a setting sun. He hammered it, folding the metal over and over, driving out impurities and layering the carbon. But the most critical moment was the quenching. The red-hot blade was plunged into a vat of oil or water. This sudden cooling locked the carbon atoms into a rigid, stressed state known as martensite. Martensite is what makes a sword hard. It is what allows it to hold an edge sharp enough to shave with. But this hardness comes at a price: internal tension. The metal is like a spring that has been wound too tight. In the warmth of a forge or the mild air of a summer day, the surrounding heat provides just enough molecular vibration to keep that tension in check. But here, in the sub-zero stillness of the mountain winter, that vibration ceases. The atoms settle into their lowest energy state. The internal stresses, which were once balanced, now pull at the microscopic boundaries of the metal grains. As you hold the blade, you can imagine the cleavage planes within the steel. If the sword were to be struck now, a crack would not follow the path of least resistance. It would shatter across these planes with the speed of sound. The cold makes the steel impatient. It no longer wants to bend or absorb. It only wants to remain in its crystalline, frozen perfection, or to cease being a single piece altogether. You take a clean piece of linen and a small jar of rendered deer fat. This is the morning ritual of maintenance. The fat is solid, a pale, creamy white. You scoop a small amount onto the cloth and begin to rub it onto the blade. The friction of your hand creates just enough heat to melt the fat, and it spreads across the steel in a thin, shimmering film. This film serves a dual purpose. It protects the metal from the moisture of your breath, which would otherwise condense and cause rust, and it fills the microscopic scratches that could become the birthplace of a fracture. The sound of the cloth sliding over the steel is a rhythmic, shushing noise, swish, swish, swish. It is a hypnotic sound like the wind through long grass. You follow the line of the fuller, the long groove that runs down the center of the blade. The fuller is often called a blood groove, but in truth, its purpose is purely architectural. It allows the blade to be wider and stiffer without adding unnecessary weight, much like an I-beam in a modern building. As your finger moves along the groove, you feel the perfection of the taper, the way the metal thins toward the point. Outside, the sun has finally cleared the shoulder of the peak. The light hits the frost on the window, and for a few minutes, the room is filled with a dazzling, prismatic glow. The ice crystals act as thousands of tiny prisms, breaking the white light into flecks of crimson, gold, and violet. They dance on the stone walls and across the surface of the sword, making the cold metal look as though it is encrusted with jewels. You move to the window and scrape a small circle in the frost with your fingernail. The ice is thick and stubborn, resisting your touch before finally giving way in a spray of white powder. Looking through the small portal, you see the world outside. It is a landscape of absolute purity. The valley is filled with a sea of white, the trees looking like delicate lace dusted with sugar. There is no movement. The world is held in a state of suspended animation, a grand, frozen clockwork that has stopped ticking. The logistical reality of the day begins to settle in. Water must be obtained. You take a heavy iron cauldron from its hook by the door. It is cold, heavy, and soot-stained from years of service. You open the heavy timber door and the cold hits you like a physical blow. It is so intense that it catches in your throat, making you cough a small, white cloud of vapor. The snow is piled high against the threshold, a wall of crystalline white. You reach out and scoop a mound of snow into the cauldron. The snow is light and dry like flour. It doesn't stick together. It is too cold for that. As you pull the cauldron back inside and swing it over the fire on its adjustable crane, you listen to the first sounds of the snow melting. At first, there is a soft, hissing sound as the bottom of the pot heats up. Then, as the snow begins to collapse into a slush, there is a low, gurgling noise. The transition of snow to water is a slow, energy-intensive process. It requires a tremendous amount of heat to break the crystalline bonds of the ice. You sit by the fire and watch as the white mound in the pot slowly shrinks, revealing the dark, shimmering liquid beneath. The steam begins to rise, a thick white column that smells faintly of the iron pot and the mountain air. This steam is a comfort. It adds a touch of humidity to the bone-dry air of the room, making it easier to breathe. You watch the bubbles begin to form at the bottom of the pot, tiny, silver pearls that rise and pop with a soft blup. The sound is steady and rhythmic, a liquid counterpart to the crackling of the wood. As the water nears a boil, you prepare a simple breakfast, a hunk of hard rye bread which you have kept near the hearth to soften, and a piece of dried venison. The venison is salty and tough, requiring long, slow chewing. The act of eating is as monotonous and necessary as the fire. Each bite is a delivery of energy, a fueling of the internal furnace that keeps the blood moving through your veins. The sword still rests on the table, now coated in a protective sheen of fat. It is a silent witness to your mourning. You think about the smiths in the far north, in the lands of the Vikings, who knew the secrets of the pattern-welded blades. They would twist rods of high-carbon and low-carbon steel together, creating a blade that had the hardness of a diamond and the flexibility of a whip. They were trying to solve the very problem that the cold highlights: how to make something that is both strong and resilient. Their blades, when polished, would show patterns like flowing water or the grain of wood, a physical map of the struggle to balance the elements. But even those legendary blades were subject to the laws of the winter. In the deep cold, even the best steel becomes more glass-like. The grains of the metal, which in the summer are like a tightly woven fabric, become in the winter like a stack of dry bricks. One wrong move, one sharp impact, and the stack collapses. The room is now quite warm, at least in the immediate vicinity of the hearth. The heat has begun to push back the boundaries of the cold, creating a comfortable sphere of existence. You lean back against the stone wall, feeling the warmth of the fire through your tunic. The rhythm of the melting snow, the crackle of the oak, and the soft hiss of the steam create a symphony of the mundane. It is a world reduced to its simplest elements: heat, water, stone, and steel. The history of the world is often told through its battles and its kings, but the true history is found here, in the quiet struggle against the cold, in the careful maintenance of tools, and in the patient understanding of the materials that make up our world. A sword is not just a weapon. It is a testament to human ingenuity and its constant dialogue with the natural world. And in the winter of 1284, that dialogue is a whisper, a soft, cold breath that reminds us of the fragility of all things. As you sit there, the warmth of the food and the fire begins to induce a pleasant, heavy lethargy. The world outside can wait. The snow will not melt for months. The sword will remain on the table, safe and still. The fire will continue to burn, a small, defiant sun in the heart of the mountain. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to the heartbeat of the house. Thump, 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 thump. The sound is steady, reassuring, and infinitely slow. There is nothing to do but exist in the stillness, a part of the long, white silence of the winter. The morning light has now fully claimed the room, though it is a pale, filtered light that seems to have been stripped of all its heat by the vast banks of snow outside. The fire in the hearth has settled into a steady, companionable hum, the oak logs having surrendered their outer bark to the flames and now glowing with a deep, structural intensity. In this quiet hour, the mind turns to the smaller, more intricate tasks of maintenance, the quiet logistics of survival that fill the long, white months of a mountain winter. You move from the warmth of the hearth toward the heavy oak workbench that sits against the eastern wall. This workbench is a landscape in itself. Its surface is scarred with the history of 1,000 small projects, notches from a slipping chisel, dark rings where a hot cup has rested, and the faint, silvery sheen of dried fish glue. It smells of old wood, cold iron, and the faint, citrusy tang of a particular resin used to seal leather. On the far corner of the bench sits a small, rectangular block of gray siltstone, a whetstone. It is a humble object, but in the world of the medieval smith and soldier, it is as essential as the bread and the fire. You pick up a small, earthen jug of water that has been warming near the fire. The water is clear, and as you pour a few drops onto the surface of the whetstone, you watch how the liquid behaves. On the dry stone, the water beads for a fraction of a second before being pulled into the microscopic pores of the silt. You pour a little more, creating a thin, shimmering film of moisture that clings to the gray surface. This is the lubricant, the medium through which the metal and the stone will conduct their slow, grinding conversation. The tool you have chosen to sharpen today is not the great sword, but a smaller, more intimate companion, a seax, a single-edged utility knife with a thick spine and a blade forged from the same batch of iron as the sword. You hold the hilt in your hand, a simple cylinder of polished walnut, and feel the balance of the blade. It is cold, but the warmth of your palm begins to transfer into the wood, a slow migration of heat that feels grounding and real. The process of sharpening is the ultimate exercise in monotony. It requires a steady hand, a fixed angle, and an infinite supply of patience. You place the edge of the blade against the stone at a precise 20-degree angle. You can feel the bite of the stone through the steel. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, you push the blade away from you, sliding it along the full length of the stone. Shhhhshhh. The sound is soft and rhythmic, a hushing noise that seems to mirror the sound of the wind outside, but contained within the four walls of your sanctuary. Shhhhshhh. You pull the blade back, maintaining the angle with a muscle memory that has been forged over years of winter mornings. Shhhhshhh. As the metal grinds against the siltstone, a slurry begins to form, a dark gray paste made of microscopic particles of stone and tiny filaments of steel. This slurry is the actual cutting agent. It is a liquid sandpaper, a gentle abrasive that slowly, atom by atom, reshapes the edge of the blade. As you work, your mind drifts back to the internal world of the metal, specifically the hidden impurities that make the winter so dangerous for a blade. In the 13th century, the art of the forge is one of intuition and tradition, but the physics are unforgiving. One of the greatest enemies of the winter sword is an element the smiths cannot see, but whose effects they know all too well: phosphorus. In the high-heat environment of the bloomery, the primitive furnace where iron is first smelted from ore, phosphorus often sneaks in, hidden within the iron-rich rocks or even the charcoal made from certain types of wood. To the smith, a small amount of phosphorus is almost a blessing in the summer. It makes the iron fluid, allowing it to flow more easily into the shapes of the mold or the hammer. It makes the metal harder, and in the balmy air of a July afternoon, a phosphoric blade holds a wicked, glass-like edge. But phosphorus is a treacherous ally. It causes a condition known as cold shortness. At the microscopic level, Phosphorus atoms are larger and more disruptive than the carbon atoms that provide the steel its strength. They do not fit neatly into the iron's crystal lattice. Instead, they migrate toward the grain boundaries, the invisible seams where the individual crystals of iron meet and lock together. In the warmth, these grain boundaries are somewhat flexible. They act like the mortar between bricks that has just enough moisture to allow for a tiny bit of settling. But as the temperature drops toward the freezing point and then plunges far below it, the phosphorus makes the mortar turn to brittle glass. The bonds between the grains of iron become fragile. The metal, which seemed so strong in the forge, is now internally shorted. It has lost its ability to hold itself together under stress. SHHHSHHH. The rhythm of the sharpening continues. You flip the blade over to work the other side. The sound changes slightly, a higher pitch as the stone meets the fresh steel. SHHHSHHH. You are not just sharpening an edge. You are observing the physics of the world. You think about how a single blow in the deep cold, even against a wooden shield, could cause a cold short blade to simply shatter into a dozen jagged pieces. It wouldn't bend. It wouldn't dull. It would simply cease to be a tool and become a collection of shards. This is why the wise traveler in the winter mountains treats his steel with a reverence that borders on the religious. He does not strike unless he must. He keeps his blade close to his body, beneath his cloak, using the heat of his own blood to keep the phosphorus from claiming the grain boundaries. You pause for a moment to wipe the slurry from the blade with a piece of soft buckskin. The steel beneath is starting to show a mirror finish at the very edge, a thin, bright line that catches the orange glow of the fire. You touch the edge with the pad of your thumb, not a press, but a light, lateral brush. It is becoming scary sharp, a term used by those who know that a truly sharp blade requires less force to use, and therefore puts less stress on the brittle body of the metal. The room has reached a state of perfect thermal equilibrium. The heat from the fire is balanced by the cold radiating from the stones, creating a pocket of stillness around the workbench. You look at the other tools laid out in their neat, habitual rows. There is the heavy draw knife, used for shaping the staves of longbows. There are the small, delicate punches for leatherwork. And there is the heavy iron hammer, its head dark and pitted from years of striking hot metal. Each of these objects is subject to the same laws of the winter. Each one is a collection of atoms, slowing down, huddling together against the thermal vacuum of the mountain night. You reach for a small wooden box on the edge of the bench. Inside, nestled in a bed of dried sheep's wool, is a cake of yellow beeswax. It is hard and cold, but as you pick it up and hold it in your hand, the heat of your skin begins to soften the outer layer. The smell is wonderful, a concentrated essence of 1,000 summer flowers, of clover and thyme and mountain heather, all preserved in the waxy labor of the bees. It is a smell of life and industry, a direct contrast to the sterile, frozen world outside the window. You rub the cake of wax along the spine of the Sikhs. The wax leaves a thin, pale track on the dark steel. Then, using a clean woolen rag, you buff the wax into the metal. The friction creates a gentle heat, and the wax melts into the microscopic pores of the iron, creating a barrier that is even more durable than the deer fat you used on the sword. This is the winter coat for the tool. It prevents the moisture of the air from reaching the iron, but it also provides a microscopic layer of dampening. It is a quiet thought, perhaps more mystical than scientific, that the wax of the summer bee helps the iron of the earth survive the bite of the winter frost. The sound of the rag on the steel is a soft, rhythmic thrub thrub thrub. It is even quieter than the whetstone, a comforting domestic sound. As you work, you watch the way the light from the window plays across the waxed surface. The light is shifting now, the sun climbing higher into the pale blue sky. The shadows in the room are shortening, retreating into the corners where the heavy chests and the sacks of grain are stored. You think about the logistics of the grain. In the corner of the room, 3 large sacks of rye and barley sit on a raised wooden platform to keep them away from any dampness that might seep through the floor. Each sack is made of heavy, coarse hemp, tied with a simple twine. This is the lifeblood of the outpost. Every few days, you take a small portion of the grain and grind it in a hand quern, 2 circular stones, one resting on the other. The act of grinding grain is perhaps the most monotonous task of all, but it is also the most meditative. The sound of stone on stone, the slow trickle of the flour into the wooden tray, the smell of the broken husks. It is a process that has not changed in 5,000 years. It is a reminder that while the technology of the sword and the chemistry of the steel may change, the basic needs of the human body remain the same. We need heat, we need shelter, and we need the slow, steady transformation of the Earth's bounty into the fuel for our lives. You set the seeks down on the bench. It is finished, sharp, protected, and ready. The simple act of maintaining a single tool has taken nearly an hour, and yet it felt like no time at all. In the winter, time does not move in a straight line. It circles back on itself, a series of repetitive tasks that create a sense of safety and order in a world that is inherently chaotic and cold. You stand up and stretch, feeling the pull of the muscles in your back and shoulders. The room is quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely call of a raven somewhere far out in the snowy wastes. The raven's cry is a sharp, metallic sound, like 2 stones being struck together. It is a sound that defines the wilderness. You walk back to the hearth and add another log to the fire. It is a large piece of cherry wood, saved for its sweet scent and its steady burn. As the flames lick around the red-brown bark, a new aroma fills the room, a faint, fruity sweetness that blends with the pine and the wood smoke. You sit back down in your heavy wooden chair, the one with the sheepskin draped over the back, and look once more at the sword on the table. It remains there, a silent protagonist in our story of the cold. The firelight glints off its fuller, reflecting a world of orange and gold. You think about the ductile-to-brittle transition, that invisible line in the temperature scale where the metal loses its soul. It is a reminder that everything has a limit. Even the strongest steel, forged in the hottest fires, has a point where it can no longer cope with the environment. It is a lesson in humility, and a lesson in the importance of the small, quiet things. The fire, the wax, the blankets, and the slow, steady rhythm of a winter's day. The warmth of the room is now absolute. It is a thick, golden atmosphere that seems to protect you from the very thought of the cold. Your eyes trace the patterns of the stone walls, the way the mortar fills the gaps between the uneven rocks. You follow the line of a single beam across the ceiling, noting the knots in the wood and the way the smoke has darkened the grain over the years. Each detail is a point of focus, a way to anchor the mind in the present moment. There is a profound peace in this boredom. It is not the boredom of a mind seeking distraction, but the boredom of a mind that has found its center. It is the peace of the hibernating bear, of the seed beneath the snow, of the mountain itself. You are part of the landscape now, a slow-moving element in a world that has decided to take a long, deep breath. As the sun continues its slow arc across the sky, you feel a sense of profound gratitude for the walls, for the fire, and for the knowledge of the steel. The winter is not an enemy to be fought, but a season to be lived through with care and attention to detail. You close your eyes, the scent of the cherry wood and the beeswax enveloping you like a warm cloak. The world is still. The sword is safe. The fire is bright. And the long, quiet story of the winter continues its slow, hypnotic unspooling, one heartbeat at a time. The sun has reached its zenith, though in this high mountain pass, the zenith is a modest thing. It hangs low in the southern sky, a pale, white-gold disk that provides light without the slightest hint of warmth. The shadows in the room have reached their shortest point, huddling beneath the heavy furniture like shy, dark animals. It is the time of day when the house itself seems to hold its breath, caught between the slow ascent of the morning and the inevitable, lingering descent into the long winter evening. You find yourself standing by the large, iron-bound chest at the foot of the bed. This chest is made of bog oak, wood that has spent centuries submerged in the anaerobic depths of a peat marsh, turning it as black and dense as the stone of the mountainside. The iron straps that bind it are cold to the touch, and as you lift the heavy lid, the hinges give a long, slow, rhythmic creak, a sound that has a definite pitch, like a low note played on a cello. Inside, the chest is a repository of softness, filled with the textiles that make life in the 1200s possible. You reach in and pull out a length of heavy, undyed felt. This is not woven cloth. It is the result of thousands of hours of labor, where wool fibers have been matted together using heat, moisture, and pressure. The felt is nearly half an inch thick, a dense, gray material that feels like a solid wall of warmth. Your task for this quiet hour is a simple one. You are going to cut new insoles for your boots and create small gaskets for the cracks in the door frame where the moss has begun to crumble. The process of working with the felt is a tactile delight. You lay the sheet out on the workbench, the gray fibers catching the pale light from the window. You take a small piece of charcoal and trace the outline of your foot onto the surface. The charcoal makes a soft, scratching sound, scritch, 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 as it leaves a dark, dusty trail on the wool. Then you reach for the shears. These are not the delicate scissors of a later age, but heavy, spring-loaded iron shears, forged with two broad blades that meet with a satisfying metallic snip. Cutting the felt requires a slow, steady pressure. As the blades close, you feel the resistance of the dense fibers. The sound is a muffled, crunchy noise like walking on frozen grass. Snip, snip, snip. You follow the charcoal line with painstaking precision, your eyes focused on the tiny point where the two blades meet. Each cut is small, perhaps only an inch long, as the thickness of the material demands a patient approach. You are in no hurry. The winter has given you the gift of time, and you intend to use it to ensure that your world is as perfectly insulated as possible. As you work, you consider the physics of insulation, a concept the medieval mind understands through experience rather than equations. This felt works because it traps air. Thousands of tiny, microscopic pockets of air are held captive within the tangled web of the wool. Air is a poor conductor of heat. It acts as a barrier, preventing the warmth of your body from leaking out into the hungry cold of the floor. In the same way, the stone walls of your dwelling are thick not just for strength, but for thermal mass. During the day, the stones near the hearth absorb the energy of the fire. They store it, the heat migrating slowly through the crystalline structure of the granite and limestone. At night, when the fire burns low, the stones give that heat back, a slow, invisible radiation that keeps the air from turning to ice. It is a slow-motion exchange, a thermal dialogue between the fire and the mountain. Once the insoles are cut, you turn your attention to the thin strips of felt that will serve as gaskets for the door. You take a small pot of tallow, rendered beef fat that has been mixed with a bit of beeswax to keep it pliable. The tallow is a pale, creamy yellow, and it has a faint, earthy smell. Using a small wooden spatula, you spread a thin layer of the tallow along one side of the felt strips. This creates a tacky surface that will allow the felt to stick to the wood of the door frame. And it also creates an airtight seal that no draft can penetrate. You walk to the door, the strips of felt draped over your arm like soft, gray ribbons. The door itself is a masterpiece of medieval joinery. 3 layers of oak planks, oriented in different directions to prevent warping, and held together by dozens of hand-forged iron rivets. You find the spot near the top hinge where a tiny, hair-thin gap has appeared. You can feel the cold air pushing through it, a needle of ice that cuts through the warmth of the room. You carefully press the tallow-coated felt into the gap. You use the back of your thumbnail to wedge it in, feeling the softness of the wool compress and then expand to fill the space. As you work your way down the frame, the whistling sound of the wind, which you hadn't even consciously noticed, suddenly ceases. The silence in the room deepens, becoming more profound, more absolute. You have successfully defended your sanctuary against the encroachment of the exterior world. This focus on the small, the minute, and the mundane is the key to surviving the high winters. It is the same mindset that governs the care of the sword. You return to the table where the blade rests, and you notice something you hadn't seen before. Near the pommel, the heavy iron weight at the end of the hilt, there is a tiny gap between the metal and the wooden grip. This is the result of differential thermal contraction. Wood and metal are 2 very different substances with 2 very different reactions to the cold. The wood of the grip, though seasoned and oiled, contains a trace of moisture. As the temperature drops, the wood contracts more significantly than the steel of the tang it surrounds. The grip has shrunk, just a fraction of a millimeter, but enough to create a subtle play in the hilt. In the heat of a summer day, this hilt would be rock solid, the wood swollen and tight against the metal. But now, in the heart of the winter, the sword has become loose in its own skin. This is another reason why swords were more prone to failure in the cold. A loose hilt creates a point of vibration. If the blade were to strike a hard object, the energy of the impact would not be distributed smoothly through the hilt into the hand. Instead, it would chatter, creating a sharp, jarring resonance that could easily snap the brittle, frozen steel. You decide to remedy this with the same patient care you applied to the door. You take a very thin sliver of the felt you just cut, and you carefully wedge it into the gap between the crossguard and the wooden grip. You use a small iron needle to push the fibers deep into the crevice. Then you apply a single drop of warm linseed oil. The oil soaks into the felt and the wood, causing the fibers to swell slightly. Within minutes, the hilt is tight again, the vibration dampened by the soft, oily wool. The sun has begun its long, slow slide toward the western peaks. The light in the room is changing from a pale white to a soft, dusty amber. This is the golden hour, though in the winter, it is a gold that feels more like brass, cool and metallic. You move to the corner of the room where the fuel is stored. A massive pile of split logs is stacked neatly against the wall, reaching almost to the ceiling. This pile is your bank account, your insurance policy against the elements. You spend a few minutes reorganizing the front of the stack, a task that is purely for the sake of order and the satisfaction of the tactile. You pick up a log of birch. Its bark is like silver paper, peeling away in delicate, translucent curls. Underneath, the wood is a creamy white, marked with the dark, horizontal lines of the lenticels. It is light and airy, perfect for a quick, hot fire. Next, you handle a piece of oak. It is the opposite of the birch, heavy, dense, and dark. The bark is thick and deeply furrowed like the skin of an ancient elephant. When you knock two pieces of oak together, they don't make a thud. They make a sharp, resonant clack like stone hitting stone. This is the wood that will burn all through the night, providing the steady, reliable heat that keeps the frost at bay. You begin to count the logs, a slow and rhythmic tally that serves to calm the mind. 1, 2, 3. You move them from one pile to another, feeling the weight of each piece in your hands, the roughness of the bark, and the occasional prick of a splinter. 4, 5, 6. The sound of the wood moving is a series of low, woody thumps, a percussion section for the silence of the room. 7, 8, 9. You realize that you have enough fuel to last for at least another 3 weeks, even if the storms intensify. This knowledge is a physical sensation of relief, a loosening of a knot in the pit of your stomach. As you stack the final log, you notice a small patch of lichen on the bark, a tiny circular world of sea green and gray. Even here in the dead of winter, on a piece of wood destined for the fire, life persists in its most patient and resilient form. You trace the edge of the lichen with your finger, marveling at its complexity. It is a symbiotic partnership between a fungus and an alga, a tiny lesson in cooperation and survival. The room is growing dimmer now, the shadows stretching across the floorboards like long, dark fingers. It is time to prepare for the transition to the evening. You take a small iron lamp, a simple dish with a handle, and fill it with a bit of the rendered tallow. You place a wick made of twisted hemp into the fat, letting it soak up the oil for a moment. Then you take a small splinter of wood, light it from the fire, and touch it to the wick. The lamp flickers into life, a tiny orange flame that casts a warm, wobbling circle of light on the workbench. The light of the lamp is very different from the light of the fire or the sun. It is intimate and focused, a small bubble of clarity in the gathering gloom. You watch the flame for a moment, seeing how it reacts to the slight movement of air as you breathe. It is a living thing, a small, hungry spirit that consumes the fat of the earth to push back the dark. You sit back down in your chair, the sheepskin soft against your back. The sword on the table is now half hidden in the shadows, its steel catching the occasional glint from the lamp. You think about the men who carried these blades into the far north, into the lands where the sun doesn't rise for months at a time. How did they maintain their sanity in the face of such absolute, crushing cold and darkness? They did it perhaps through these same rituals, through the sharpening of knives, the cutting of felt, the counting of logs, through the careful, monotonous attention to the details of their environment. They found beauty in the frost on the window and safety in the smell of the wood smoke. They understood that the winter is not a void, but a presence, a slow, heavy weight that requires a corresponding slowness and weight in the soul. The sound of the fire has changed. The oak logs have reached that stage where they are no longer flaming, but have become solid blocks of glowing carbon. They hiss softly as the last of the moisture escapes through the end grain. The room is filled with a deep, pulsing warmth that seems to emanate from the very center of the earth. You pick up a piece of the leftover felt and begin to rub it between your palms. The friction creates a gentle heat, and the lanolin in the wool softens your skin. The repetitive motion is hypnotic, round and round, round and round. Your thoughts become as soft and blurred as the edges of the shadows. The transition from the active work of the day to the passive observation of the evening is almost complete. Outside, the first stars are beginning to appear in the darkening indigo of the sky. They are sharp, brilliant points of light, looking like holes poked in the velvet fabric of the night. The cold out there is intensifying, the temperature dropping with every passing minute. But inside, behind the thick stone walls and the felt-sealed door, the world is stable. The hilt of the sword is tight. The water in the cauldron is warm. The grain in the sacks is dry. You lean your head back and close your eyes. The only sound is the rhythmic hiss-click of the cooling embers and the slow, steady sound of your own breathing. The story of the steel, the story of the winter, and the story of the house are all woven together into a single, seamless tapestry of peace. You are exactly where you need to be. The cold is a distant memory, a theoretical concept that has no power over the warm, golden reality of your sanctuary. As the lamp flickers, casting a final, dancing shadow against the wall, you feel the heavy, comforting embrace of sleep begin to tug at the edges of your mind. There is no conflict here. There is no urgency. There is only the long, quiet wait for the dawn and the patient, silent endurance of the mountain winter. The twilight has deepened into a true, heavy indigo, a color so dense it feels as though the sky has become a physical weight resting upon the peaks of the mountains. Inside the stone walls, the orange glow of the hearth has become the absolute center of the universe. The light does not travel far. It clings to the rough surfaces of the granite, illuminating the edges of the furniture while leaving the corners of the room in a state of soft, velvety mystery. This is the hour of the interior, the time when the world outside the window ceases to exist in any practical sense, replaced by the immediate, tactile reality of the room. You find yourself drawn toward the small larder, a narrow alcove built into the north wall where the temperature remains just a few degrees above freezing, acting as a natural chest of ice. Entering the larder is like stepping into a different climate. The air here is sharp and still, carrying the complex, mingled scents of a successful harvest. There is the earthy, musk-like smell of the root cellar, onions, turnips, and carrots tucked into crates of dry sand to keep them from shriveling. There is the sharp, salty tang of the cured meats hanging from the rafters. You reach up and touch a side of salted pork. The surface is rough, encrusted with large, translucent crystals of sea salt that feel like coarse sand against your fingertips. The meat is as hard as a plank of wood, cured by time, salt, and the dry mountain air. You begin the evening's inventory, a task of quiet counting that provides a profound sense of security. You move slowly from shelf to shelf, your hands tracing the shapes of the storage vessels. There are the heavy stoneware jars, their glazes a deep mottled brown, containing the precious stores of rendered lard and clarified butter. You lift the lid of one jar, and the sound is a soft, ceramic clink. The lard inside is a pure, snowy white, its surface as smooth as a frozen pond. You take a small wooden scoop and press it into the fat. The resistance is firm, and the sound of the scoop cutting through the solid grease is a soft, muffled scritch. You record the amount in your mind, enough for many weeks of cooking, for greasing the hinges of the door, and for fuel for the small iron lamps. Next to the lard sit the sacks of dried pulses, peas and beans that rattle like small pebbles when you disturb them. You run your hand through a bowl of dried gray peas. They are hard, cool, and perfectly round, sliding between your fingers with a dry, rustling sound that is reminiscent of rain on a thatched roof. SSSSHSHHHH. The sound is hypnotic. You count the measures, knowing that each handful represents a bowl of thick, warming pottage. There are the strings of onions, their papery skins crinkling at the slightest touch, sounding like ancient parchment. There are the bunches of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, and sage, hanging upside down. When you brush against them, they release a ghostly, concentrated essence of the summer garden, a sharp, green fragrance that cuts through the heavy smell of salt and stone. As you stand in the cold stillness of the larder, your thoughts return once more to the sword resting on the table in the main room. We have spoken of phosphorus and the transition of atoms, but there is another secret hidden within the steel of 1284, the presence of slag inclusions. In the medieval world, the process of smelting iron is an imperfect art. When the iron ore is heated in the bloomery, it never fully melts into a liquid. Instead, it becomes a glowing, spongy mass called a bloom. Within this mass are trapped bits of the rocky ore and the silica from the furnace lining, substances known as slag. The smith hammers the bloom, folding it and welding it to squeeze out as much slag as possible, but microscopic traces always remain. These inclusions are essentially tiny pockets of glass hidden within the metal. In the warmth of the forge, or even on a temperate day, these glass-like slivers are harmless, cushioned by the more resilient iron around them. But in the extreme cold of this mountain night, these inclusions become deadly. Glass does not contract at the same rate as metal. As the sword cools, the iron pulls away from the slag, creating microscopic voids, tiny, invisible catacombs of air. If the blade is struck in this state, these slag inclusions act as stress risers. A crack that might have been stopped by a pure grain of iron instead finds a path of least resistance through the brittle glass of the slag. The crack travels with the speed of a lightning bolt, jumping from one inclusion to the next. This is why a sword that has served a knight through a dozen summer battles might suddenly fail during a simple winter practice. The cold has revealed the hidden imperfections of its birth, turning the very history of its manufacture into its greatest weakness. You take a single large turnip from the sand crate. It is heavy and cool, its skin a dusty purple fading into a creamy white at the root. This will be the heart of your evening meal. You carry it back into the main room, moving from the sharp chill of the larder into the embrace of the hearth's warmth. The transition is a physical relief, a softening of the skin. You sit at the workbench and take up your newly sharpened seeks. The task of peeling the turnip is a study in precision and slowness. You place the edge of the blade against the tough skin. Because the knife is so sharp, it requires almost no pressure to begin the cut. The blade slides beneath the purple skin with a soft, moist zip. You peel in one continuous spiral, the skin curling away like a ribbon. The sound is rhythmic and satisfying, a clean, wet sound of vegetable fibers being parted. Zip, zip, zip. Underneath the skin, the flesh of the turnip is crisp and white, smelling faintly of the earth and a sharp, peppery sweetness. Once peeled, you begin to dice the turnip. You slice it into thick rounds, the knife making a solid thump as it hits the wooden cutting board. Then you cut the rounds into cubes, each one a perfect, pale geometry. You do this slowly, enjoying the repetitive motion of the hand and the steady, percussive rhythm of the blade. The cubes of turnip pile up on the board, a small mountain of sustenance. You move to the fire, where the cauldron of water has been simmering since the morning. The water is now a dark, rich broth, having been infused with a few scraps of the salted pork and a handful of the dried peas. You add the turnips, the pieces disappearing into the liquid with a series of soft, liquid splashes. Plop, plop, plop. You take a large wooden spoon, carved from a single piece of apple wood, and stir the pot. The spoon is smooth and heavy, and as it moves through the thickening pottage, it makes a low, swirling sound against the iron sides of the cauldron. Swirl, thrum, swirl. The steam rises in a thick, fragrant cloud, carrying the scent of the pork, the peas, and the fresh turnip. It is a humble smell, the smell of survival and domestic peace. You adjust the height of the cauldron on its iron crane, moving it a few inches further from the direct flame so that it can simmer at a slow, lazy pace. The bubbles that rise to the surface are large and viscous, bursting with a soft blup that echoes in the quiet room. You watch the bubbles for a long time, the motion as hypnotic as the flickering of the flames. While the pottage cooks, you move to the small writing desk in the corner. It is a simple slanted surface of pine, polished by use and stained with drops of oak gall ink. On the desk lies your ledger, a book of thick handmade paper bound in stiff vellum. This is where you record the logistics of the outpost, the arrival of the first snow, the remaining bushels of grain, the maintenance of the tools. You take up your quill, made from the primary wing feather of a goose. The tip has been cut into a sharp nib, and as you dip it into the inkwell, the dark fluid climbs into the slit of the quill through capillary action. You begin to write. The sound of the quill on the paper is one of the most iconic sounds of the medieval world, a dry, scratchy, rhythmic noise that speaks of patience and the preservation of thought. Scritch, scratch, scritch, scratch. Each letter is formed with care, the ink flowing onto the page in a deep, wet black before slowly soaking into the fibers of the paper. You record the date, the 17th day of February in the year of our Lord 1284. You write about the temperature, noting that the frost ferns on the window have reached the center of the pane. You record the inventory of the larder, the numbers lining up in neat, orderly columns. The act of writing is a way of imposing order on the vast, chaotic winter. By naming the things you have and the tasks you have completed, you make the world manageable. You make the silence productive. The quill moves across the page with a steady, unhurried pace. Scritch-scratch. You describe the condition of the sword, noting the tightness of the hilt and the application of the wax. You think about how, in centuries to come, someone might find this ledger and read about this very night. They might wonder about the person who sat by this fire, listening to the pottage bubble and the wind sigh. They might realize that the history of the world is not just a series of grand events, but a continuous chain of small, quiet moments like this one, moments of maintenance, of preparation, and of simple, unvarnished existence. You set the quill down and watch the ink dry. It loses its liquid sheen, turning into a matte, permanent record of your day. The room is now filled with the deep, savory aroma of the pottage. You return to the hearth and take a bowl from the shelf. The bowl is made of turned maple, its grains spiraling around the center like a whirlpool. It feels warm and light in your hands. You ladle the pottage into the bowl. The liquid is thick and golden, the cubes of turnip soften but still holding their shape. You carry the bowl back to your chair by the fire, the heat radiating through the wood into your palms. As you take your first spoonful, the warmth spreads through your body, a slow and comforting glow that starts in the chest and reaches out to the tips of your fingers and toes. The turnip is sweet and earthy, the broth rich with the salt of the pork. Each mouthful is a celebration of the simple fact of being alive and being warm in a cold world. The sound of the spoon against the wooden bowl is a soft, rhythmic clack-clack. It is the only sound in the room other than the fire and the wind. You eat slowly, savoring the texture of the food and the way the steam warms your face. There is no need for conversation. There is no need for distraction. The act of eating is enough. The warmth is enough. Outside, the mountain is silent. The snow continues to fall, a gentle, relentless accumulation of white upon white. The world is being simplified, its jagged edges smoothed over by the drifts. Inside, your world is also simple. It is a world of stone, wood, steel, and fire. It is a world where every object has a purpose and every task has its time. As you finish the pottage, you feel a deep, profound sense of contentment. The logistics of the day are complete. The tools are ready. The larder is full. The ledger is written. You lean back in your chair, the empty bowl resting in your lap. The fire has burned down to a stable, glowing mass of orange coals, casting a steady, unwavering light across the room. The sword on the table is a dark silhouette, a silent guardian of the night. The transition from the activities of the evening to the total stillness of the night is beginning. You feel the weight of your eyelids, the slow rhythm of your heart, the absolute peace of the sanctuary. The winter is long, but it is not a burden. It is a time for rest, for reflection, and for the slow, quiet endurance of the soul. You are safe. You are warm. The world is held in the silver grip of the frost, and you are tucked away in its heart, as steady and patient as the mountain itself. The empty maple bowl rests in your lap, still retaining a faint, lingering warmth from the turnip pottage. The last drop of broth has been wiped clean with a crust of bread, leaving only the beautiful, swirling grain of the wood visible beneath the light of the tallow lamp. You sit for a moment, simply feeling the weight of the bowl, its smooth, turned surface a testament to a craftsman's patience. The transition from the act of eating to the act of cleaning is another of the day's slow, deliberate rituals. You rise from the heavy chair, the sheepskin momentarily clinging to your wool tunic before letting go with a soft, static-filled sigh. You carry the bowl and the spoon to the small wooden basin near the hearth. The water inside, which you heated earlier, is still steaming gently, though its surface is now perfectly still, reflecting the orange glow of the embers like a dark, liquid mirror. To clean the wood, you do not use harsh chemicals. You use a small piece of rough linen and a tiny amount of soap made from wood ash and rendered fat. The soap is a pale gray, slightly soft, and smells of the hearth itself, an alkaline, smoky scent that is strangely clean. You dip the linen into the warm water, and the sound of the fabric breaking the surface is a soft, liquid sloof. You rub the soap into the cloth, creating a thin, milky lather. The process of washing the bowl is a circular motion, the cloth tracing the curve of the wood over and over. Swish, swish, swish. You feel the texture of the grain through the linen, the slight ridges where the chisel once moved, now worn smooth by years of use. You rinse the bowl in a second basin of clear, cool water. The water cascades over the maple in a shimmering sheet. The droplets bead up and roll away, dancing across the surface before disappearing into the depths. Drying the bowl is equally methodical. You use a fresh cloth, one made of heavy, sun-bleached hemp. It is coarse and thirsty. As you rub the wood, it makes a dry, rhythmic squeak, a sound of absolute cleanliness. You place the bowl and spoon back on their high shelf, lining them up with a precision that borders on the architectural. Everything has its place, and in the winter, the order of the household is the anchor that prevents the mind from drifting into the vast, white chaos outside. Now, with the meal finished and the tools of the table put away, you turn your attention to a task of repair. You reach for your heavy winter cloak, which has been hanging on a peg by the door. It is a massive garment made of double-layered wool, dyed a deep, somber indigo that looks almost black in the lamplight. It is heavy enough to tire a man's shoulders after a day of walking, but it is the only thing that stands between the blood and the frost. As you lay the cloak across the workbench, you find the flaw, a small tear in the hem, where the fabric caught on a sharp outcropping of rock during your last trek to the woodpile. The wool has frayed, the blue thread standing out like the tangled roots of a fallen tree. To fix this, you need your sewing kit, a small leather roll tied with a thong of deer hide. You unroll the leather on the bench. Inside, nestled in a piece of red felt, are your needles. They are made of polished bone, tapered to a point that is surprisingly sharp. You select a medium-sized needle, its surface ivory white and smooth as glass. Next, you choose the thread, a length of linen cord, hand-spun and sturdy. The thread is a natural cream color, and as you hold it up to the lamp, you can see the individual fibers of the flax plant twisted together in a tight, resilient spiral. Threading the needle is a moment of intense, quiet focus. In the dim light, the eye of the bone needle is a tiny, elongated void. You trim the end of the linen thread with your seeks, making a clean, angled cut. You pull a small cake of beeswax from your pocket, the same wax you used on the steel, and run the thread through it. The wax coats the linen, smoothing down the stray fibers and making the cord stiff and obedient. You squint, the light of the tallow lamp reflecting in your eyes, and with a steady hand, you guide the thread through the eye. It passes through with a tiny, nearly silent click. Now begins the stitching. This is the heart of the boring but cozy life, the repetitive, rhythmic movement of the needle. You push the bone through the thick wool. Because the cloak is double-layered, the needle meets significant resistance. You feel the fibers part, a soft, crunching sound, frip, as the point emerges on the other side. You pull the thread through, the waxed linen making a soft, melodic zip as it follows the needle. Frip, zip, frip, zip. The motion is hypnotic. You are not just closing a hole, you are reinforcing a boundary. You think about the structure of the wool under the needle. Wool is a miraculous material. Each individual fiber is covered in microscopic scales, like the shingles on a roof. When these fibers are spun and woven, the scales lock together, creating a fabric that is essentially a series of tiny, interlocking hooks. This is why wool is so warm. It holds its structure even when wet, maintaining those precious pockets of air we spoke of earlier. As you stitch, your mind wanders back to the sword on the table. You look at it through the haze of the lamplight, and you realize that the steel is also a fabric of sorts. It is a weave of crystals. And just as you are using the linen thread to reinforce the weak point in your cloak, the smith used tempering to reinforce the weak points in the steel. Earlier, we discussed how quenching makes the sword hard by locking the carbon into a stress state called martensite. But a sword that is only quenched is like a cloak made of glass threads. It is strong, but it has no give. To make the sword useful, the smith must perform the temper. He takes the hardened, brittle blade and places it back near the heat of the forge, but not in the fire. He watches the color of the steel change as it warms up. This is one of the most beautiful sights in the medieval world. As the steel reaches certain temperatures, a thin layer of oxidation forms on the surface, creating tempering colors. First comes a pale straw yellow, then a deep bronze, then a vibrant purple, and finally a brilliant cornflower blue. Each color represents a specific temperature and a specific level of toughness. For a sword, the smith usually looks for that deep blue. What is happening inside the metal during this process? The heat allows the trapped carbon atoms to move just a little bit. They migrate out of their stressed positions, forming tiny, microscopic particles of iron carbide. This relaxes the internal tension of the martensite. It's as if the steel is taking a long, deep breath. The metal becomes slightly softer, yes, but it gains the ability to deform without breaking. It gains toughness. However, even a perfectly tempered blade is subject to the treachery of the mountain winter. In 1284, the blue temper is the gold standard, but the transition temperature we discussed, the point where the metal turns brittle, is an absolute physical boundary. If the temperature outside drops low enough, even the toughest, most perfectly tempered steel will eventually cross that line. The molecular vibrations that allow the toughness to function are simply silenced by the cold. You pull the last stitch tight and tie a small, secure knot in the linen thread. You cut the excess with your knife, the blade parting the waxed cord with a satisfying snick. The repair is nearly invisible, a sturdy bridge of linen across the gap in the indigo wool. You run your thumb over the stitches, feeling the slight ridge they create. It is a job well done, a small victory over the wear and tear of the world. The lamp flickers. The tallow is running low, the wick curling into a black char. You take a small iron pin and gently straighten the wick, and the flame flares up for a moment, casting a bright, dancing light across the room. You look at the walls, the stone surfaces covered in a fine, crystalline dust of frost that has begun to migrate inward from the windows. The cold is patient. It doesn't move fast. It simply occupies space, slowly claiming everything that isn't actively defended by the fire. You decide to prepare a second lamp. This one is made of a hollowed-out stone, a piece of soft soapstone that you carved yourself during a previous winter. You fill it with a different fuel, oil pressed from walnuts. The walnut oil has a lighter, sweeter smell than the beef tallow, and it burns with a steadier, whiter flame. As you light it, the room takes on a slightly different hue, the yellow of the tallow mixing with the silver of the walnut oil. The sound of the wind has changed again. It is no longer a sigh. It has become a low, rhythmic thrumming, like the sound of a large drum being struck in a distant valley. This is the mountain pulse, a phenomenon that occurs when the wind hits the jagged peaks at just the right angle, creating a standing wave of sound. It is a deep, subsonic frequency that you feel in your bones. It is not frightening. Rather, it is deeply grounding. It reminds you of the sheer scale of the landscape you inhabit. You are a small, warm spark in a vast, cold, and ancient world. You sit back at the workbench and take up a piece of fine-grained leather. This will be a new scabbard lining for the sword. The scabbard itself is made of two thin slats of linden wood, covered in leather, but the interior, the part that touches the steel, must be special. You have a piece of sheepskin that has been sheared very short and treated with a mixture of oil and lanolin. The task is to glue this sheepskin to the inside of the wood. You take a small pot of hide glue, which has been sitting near the fire to keep it liquid. Hide glue is made from the boiled-down skins and hooves of animals, and it has a very specific pungent smell, a mix of wet dog and old library books. It is the most powerful adhesive known to your world, and once it sets, it is stronger than the wood itself. Using a small brush made of pig bristles, you apply the glue to the linden slats. The glue is thick and amber-colored, spreading across the wood in a sticky, translucent film. Squelch, squelch. The sound is wet and tactical. You carefully press the sheepskin onto the glue, the wool side facing out. You use your fingers to smooth out any bubbles, starting from the center and working toward the edges. The wool of the lining will serve two purposes. First, it will act as a cushion, preventing the sword from rattling inside the scabbard. This reduces the chatter and vibration that can lead to brittle fractures in the cold. Second, the oil and lanolin in the wool will constantly coat the blade, providing a permanent, microscopic barrier against moisture. It is a living maintenance system, a way of protecting the steel even when it is not in your hands. As the glue begins to set, the smell of the hide glue starts to fade, replaced by the cleaner scent of the walnut oil and the dying embers of the fire. You feel a sense of profound stillness. The world has narrowed down to the circle of light on your workbench and the feeling of the leather beneath your hands. There is no past, no future, only the immediate sensory reality of the present. You look at the sword one last time before you prepare to retire. In the light of the new lamp, you can see the Hammond, or the subtle transition lines in the steel, where the different crystalline structures meet. It is a map of the smith's struggle, a record of a moment of intense heat and sudden cold, captured forever in the iron. And now, that record is being tested by a different kind of cold, the slow, creeping chill of the Pyrenean winter. The room is very quiet. The mountain pulse has faded into a gentle, low-frequency hum. The fire is a mound of glowing jewels, orange and red and deep, pulsing gold. You pick up the repaired cloak and drape it over your shoulders, the weight of the wool a comforting, heavy embrace. You feel the warmth of your own body being reflected back to you by the indigo fabric. You are ready for the night. The logistics are handled. The repairs are made. The tools are protected. The world outside may be a frozen wasteland, but here within these stone walls, life is a series of slow, beautiful, and monotonous perfections. You walk toward the bed, your movements unhurried, your mind as calm as the frozen lake in the valley below. The story of the sword and the winter is still being written, but for tonight the ink is dry and the book is closed. You climb back under the heavy blankets, the lavender-scented straw greeting you with its soft, dusty perfume, and you let the long, white silence of the mountain take you once again. The deep night has now fully descended, and the world beyond the thick granite walls has entered a state of absolute crystalline stillness. The temperature outside has likely plunged to its lowest point, a realm of cold where the very air seems to sharpen into needles that seek out any microscopic flaw in the dwelling's defenses. Inside, the fire has settled into a rhythmic, glowing pulse, a living presence of deep oranges and soft, ashy grays. The house is silent, yet it is a silence filled with the tiny, structural voices of the winter, the occasional, distant crack of a timber contracting in the roof, or the faint, musical tinkle of frost shifting on the exterior of the window pane. You find yourself standing in the center of the room, your bare feet, now warmed by the thick woolen stockings, feeling the slight, honest unevenness of the chestnut floorboards. Your attention is drawn to the heavy wooden water bucket that sits on a raised stone plinth near the door. It is a stout vessel, fashioned from staves of hearth oak and bound with 3 thick bands of hand-forged iron. The water inside was drawn from the mountain spring yesterday afternoon, but in the hours since the sun vanished, the cold has begun its patient work. You pick up the ladle, a deep, heavy scoop carved from a single piece of gnarled briar root, and move toward the bucket. As the ladle approaches the surface of the water, you see a thin, translucent film of ice that has formed across the top. It is not yet a solid sheet, but a delicate, geometric lattice, like a web of spun glass. You pause for a moment, watching the way the lamplight reflects off these tiny, frozen needles. The ice is perfectly clear, yet it possesses a crystalline structure that is visible if you tilt your head just so. You can see the hexagonal patterns, the dendritic growth where the molecules of water have locked together in a slow-motion dance of freezing. You gently lower the ladle. The sound of the ice breaking is a soft, brittle crackle, a miniature version of the sound of a frozen lake groaning under weight. It is a satisfying, high-pitched noise that seems to cut through the heavy warmth of the room. You push the ladle through the slush, feeling the resistance of the ice crystals as they swirl in the liquid. This simple act of breaking the ice is a necessary ritual. If left undisturbed, the water would freeze solid by morning, expanding with such force that it could potentially burst the iron bands of the bucket. This expansion of water is a fundamental law of the winter world, and it is a law that has a direct, if invisible, impact on the sword resting on the table. We have discussed the brittleness of the metal and the danger of phosphorus, but we must also consider the interstitial spaces within the steel. No blade is truly solid at the microscopic level. There are grain boundaries, tiny voids left by the cooling of the metal, and microscopic scratches from the grinding wheel. In the humid air of the autumn, tiny molecules of water can find their way into these microscopic canyons. As the temperature drops below the freezing point, that trapped moisture undergoes a phase change. Unlike almost every other substance in the universe, water expands when it freezes. It grows by approximately 9% in volume. In the vast scale of the mountain, this expansion is what shatters boulders, a process known as ice wedging. But in the minute scale of the sword, the freezing of a single trapped droplet of moisture can act like a tiny hydraulic wedge. It exerts a massive, outward pressure against the brittle walls of the metal grains. In the warmth of summer, the steel is ductile enough to accommodate this pressure. But in the winter of 1284, the steel is already under internal stress from the cold. The expansion of freezing moisture in a microscopic crack can be the final trigger. It doesn't break the sword immediately, but it creates a fatigue point, a hidden weakness where the metal is already partially separated. When the blade is eventually pulled from its scabbard and struck against a hard surface, it doesn't just fail. It explodes along these pre-existing, ice-widened fault lines. You lift the ladle, now full of cold, clear water, and bring it to your lips. The water is so cold that it makes your teeth ache with a sharp, clean intensity. It tastes of the mountain, of deep limestone filtered through moss and the silence of the high peaks. You drink slowly, feeling the cold liquid travel down your throat, a stark contrast to the radiating heat of the hearth against your back. You pour the remaining water back into the bucket, the sound of the splash, a deep, resonant plip-glug echoing in the quiet room. You return the ladle to its hook and walk over to the sword. You pick up the scabbard which you were working on earlier. The glue has set, the sheepskin lining now firmly bonded to the linden wood. But now, you must attend to the furniture of the scabbard, the metal fittings that protect the ends. There is the locket at the mouth of the scabbard and the chape at the tip. Both are made of polished brass, a metal that provides a warm, golden contrast to the gray steel of the blade. The locket is a crucial piece of logistics. It is the gatekeeper of the blade. You take a small piece of fine wool and a drop of neatsfoot oil, a pale, heavy oil derived from the feet of cattle. You rub the oil into the interior rim of the brass locket. The sound of the wool on the brass is a soft, rhythmic shuck-shuck. The purpose of the oil here is to prevent cold welding or stiction. In extreme cold, two smooth metal surfaces can sometimes adhere to one another with surprising strength, the molecules on the surface forming a temporary, weak bond. A knight who needs his sword in a hurry cannot afford to have it stuck in the scabbard by the frost. The oil provides a microscopic boundary, a slippery layer that ensures the blade will slide out with a smooth, silent grace, regardless of the temperature. You apply the same care to the chape at the tip, ensuring that the brass is clean and the wood beneath is well sealed. The chape is what hits the ground when you lean the sword against a wall. It must be solid and secure, protecting the delicate point of the brittle steel from any sudden impact. As you work, you observe the way the light from the stone lamp plays across the brass. The brass is a soft metal compared to the steel. It doesn't suffer from the same ductile-to-brittle transition as iron. It remains pliable even in the deepest cold. This is why it is used for the fittings. It can absorb the bumps and jars of daily life without cracking, acting as a shock absorber for the more temperamental steel it protects. This is a small but vital piece of medieval engineering, a recognition of the different personalities of metals and how they must work together to survive the winter. You slide the sword into the newly lined scabbard. The fit is perfect. The blade moves in with a soft, muffled hush, the wool lining gripping the steel with a gentle, oily embrace. There is no rattle, no metallic clink. The sword is now nested, protected from the moisture of the air and the shocks of the world. You lay the sheathed sword back on the table, and it looks different now, more complete, more prepared. The room is very warm now, the heat from the fire having fully permeated the thick stone walls. You decide to perform one final check of the room's boundaries. You walk to the window, where the frost ferns have now completely obscured the glass. You lean your forehead against the cool stone of the wall. You can feel the vibration of the wind, a low, constant hum that seems to travel through the mountain and into the very foundation of the house. You look at the mortar between the stones. It is a mixture of lime, sand, and animal hair, a recipe that has held these walls together for a century. You notice a small, hair-thin crack in the mortar near the window frame. You take a small bit of the leftover tallow and wax from your pocket and press it into the crack with your thumb. The wax is soft and warm from your body heat, and it fills the void easily. This is the constant work of the winter, a never-ending dialogue of maintenance. You are a gardener of the stone, tending to the small fractures before the ice can find them. The sound of your breathing is the most prominent noise in the room, in and out. It is a slow, rhythmic pace that matches the slow, rhythmic pulse of the fire. You feel a profound sense of connection to the objects in the room, the bucket, the sword, the stones, the wool. They are not just tools or materials. They are your companions in the long night. They are the things that keep you safe, and in return, you keep them maintained. You walk back to the hearth and sit on the rug of sheepskin. The wool is thick and springy, smelling of old smoke, and the ghost of the animal it once belonged to. You watch the fire, which has now reached the white ash stage. The logs have crumbled into glowing geometric shapes, looking like the ruins of a miniature city. Occasionally, a piece of charcoal will shift, releasing a small fountain of orange sparks that drift upward into the chimney. The sight is hypnotic, a dance of light and shadow that has fascinated humans since the beginning of time. Your thoughts drift to the concept of impact energy. In the world of 1284, there is no way to measure this precisely, but every smith knows the sound of a good blade. In the summer, a sword struck against a piece of wood makes a bright, ringing sound. a ping that lasts for several seconds. This is the sound of energy traveling through the metal, being absorbed and dissipated by the vibrating atoms. In the winter, that same strike makes a dull thud or a short, sharp clack. The sound doesn't linger because the atoms cannot vibrate freely. They are locked too tightly. The energy of the impact has nowhere to go. It cannot be converted into sound or heat. Instead, it stays concentrated at the point of impact. This is the fundamental reason why the sword breaks. It is like trying to drive a nail into a piece of glass. The energy of the hammer blow, instead of being used to move the nail, is used to shatter the structure of the material. As you sit in the warmth, you realize that your own body is undergoing a similar transition. Throughout the day, you have been active, cutting felt, sharpening steel, cooking pottage. Your mind was focused, your muscles tense with the requirements of the work. But now, in the deep night, you are becoming ductile. You are letting go of the stresses of the day. You are allowing the warmth of the fire to soften the edges of your thoughts. You are becoming resilient, ready to absorb the long, quiet impact of sleep. The lamp on the workbench flickers and then goes out, the walnut oil finally exhausted. The room is plunged into a deeper darkness, illuminated only by the red glow of the hearth. The shadows grow taller, reaching up toward the smoke-blackened beams of the ceiling. You don't mind the dark. It is a soft, protective layer, a velvet blanket that covers the world. You stand up, your movements slow and fluid. You walk to the bed, the straw-filled mattress rustling as you climb in. You pull the heavy woolen blankets up to your chin, feeling the weight and the warmth settle over you. The lavender scent is faint now, but it is there, a memory of summer fields under a bright, hot sun. The sword rests on the table, safe in its scabbard. The water in the bucket is broken and still. The walls are sealed. The fire is a steady, glowing heart. The mountain winter continues its long, silent reign outside, but here inside the story has reached a point of perfect, boring peace. You close your eyes, the rhythm of the mountain pulse lulling you toward the edge of consciousness. There is no hurry. There is no conflict. There is only the long, white silence and the slow, steady heartbeat of the winter night. The deep, heavy heart of the night has arrived, that suspended moment between the last echoes of the evening and the first, hesitant gray of the pre-dawn. The fire in the hearth has transformed into a glowing, sentient landscape of embers, a miniature world of volcanic oranges and shimmering, silver-white ash. The room is at its most silent now. The wind outside has lost its voice, replaced by a cold so profound that the atmosphere seems to have solidified into a crystalline block of frozen time. Within this sanctuary of stone and wood, the air remains thick and warm, a golden pocket of existence held against the infinite, biting void of the mountain peak. You find yourself sitting at the heavy workbench once more, the walnut oil lamp casting a steady, low-energy light that barely reaches the edges of the room. Your hands, calloused and steady, reach for a small wooden box, a container made of aromatic cedar that has been used for generations to hold the smallest, most precious logistical sundries of the household. As you slide the lid open, the cedar releases a faint, spicy scent, a ghostly memory of a forest far to the south. Inside the box is a collection of small metal items, brass pins, iron nails, copper rivets, and a few stray links of mail from a hauberk that saw service decades ago. The task for this quiet hour is the sorting and cleaning of these small objects. It is a task of extreme monotony, perfectly suited to the hypnotic rhythm of the winter night. You pick up a single iron nail. It is a square-headed thing, forged by hand, with the distinct, rhythmic facets left by the smith's hammer. You can feel the slight roughness of the iron, the way the metal has oxidized into a dark, protective patina over the years. You take a small piece of fine-grained pumice stone and begin to rub the surface of the nail. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound is tiny, a microscopic abrasion that fills the silence of the room. As you clean the nail, your mind drifts back to the sword on the table, specifically to the phenomenon of thermal shock. This is a danger that the medieval mind understands through a series of taboos and traditions. A man of 1284 knows that you never bring a sword from the freezing exterior and thrust it immediately into the path of a roaring fire. To do so is to invite the blade to scream, a metaphor for the internal catastrophe that occurs when temperatures change too rapidly. At the molecular level, heat is simply vibration. When the sword is outside in the sub-zero wind, its atoms are nearly motionless, huddled together in their rigid, brittle lattice. If that frozen blade is suddenly exposed to the intense radiation of a hearth, the outer skin of the steel begins to vibrate violently as it absorbs the heat. It wants to expand, to take up more space, as the kinetic energy of the fire pushes the atoms apart. But the core of the blade, protected by the mass of the metal, remains frozen and contracted. This creates a massive internal tug-of-war. The expanding outer layer pulls against the stationary inner core. Because the steel is in its brittle state due to the cold, it has no ductility to absorb this tension. It cannot stretch. It can only snap. Microscopic fractures, no larger than a single grain of metal, begin to unzip along the grain boundaries. These are the silent killers of the steel. The sword might look unchanged, but its structural integrity has been compromised by the very warmth that was meant to protect it. The wise soldier allows his blade to warm slowly, perhaps keeping it beneath his cloak or in a cool corner of the room, letting the vibrations migrate from the outside in with the patience of the rising sun. You set the cleaned nail down on a piece of soft leather and pick up a brass pin. The brass is different, a bright, cheerful yellow in the lamplight. It feels smoother, more friendly to the touch. You use a small drop of vinegar and a pinch of salt on a rag to polish the brass. The chemical reaction creates a sharp, acidic smell that momentarily pierces the heavy scent of the wood smoke. As you rub the pin, the tarnish disappears, revealing the lustrous, golden heart of the alloy. Rub, 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 rub. The motion is circular and repetitive. You think about the crystal lattice of the brass compared to the iron. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc. Its structure is face-centered cubic, a geometric arrangement that allows for more slip planes than the body-centered cubic structure of ferritic steel. Even in this intense mountain cold, the atoms of the brass pin retain a measure of mobility. They can slide past one another more easily. This is why the pin doesn't feel as angry or brittle as the iron nail. It is a softer, more forgiving material, a quiet lesson in the diversity of the Earth's elements. The sound of the sorting continues. Clink, tap-a-tap, clink. Each object is placed in a new container categorized by size and metal. You find a single link of chainmail, a small circular ring of iron, its ends flattened and held together by a tiny microscopic rivet. This link was part of a four-square weave, where each ring is interlaced with four others. You hold it up to the lamp, marveling at the labor involved. A single hauberk could contain 30,000 of these rings, each one forged, woven, and riveted by hand. The mail, like the sword, is a study in the balance of hardness and flexibility. In the winter, the mail takes on a different character. It becomes a heat sink, a hungry net of iron that wants to pull the warmth away from the wearer's body. This is why a knight in the 1200s would never wear his mail directly against his skin. Between the iron and the flesh, there are layers of gambeson, heavy tunics of quilted linen and wool. The mail provides the protection against the cut, while the gambeson provides the insulation against the cold and the impact. As you clean the mail link, you feel the weight of history in your hands. This small ring has survived decades of use, yet it is still subject to the same laws of physics that govern the mountain itself. If you were to take this link outside and strike it with a hammer while it was frozen, it would likely shatter like a piece of dry pasta. The rivet, the smallest point of the structure, would be the first to fail, the cold making the thin iron too brittle to hold the tension of the circle. You finish the sorting. The cedar box is now organized, the small metals gleaming in their respective corners like treasure. You close the lid, the sound of the wood meeting with a soft, final thunk. The task is done. The logistics of the hardware are secure. You feel a sense of accomplishment, however small. In the winter, these small victories are the bread and butter of sanity. You stand up and stretch, your joints giving a series of soft, satisfying pops. The room feels even warmer now, the thermal mass of the stones having reached a state of deep, radiating saturation. You walk to the window and breathe a small circle of warmth onto the frost. The ice thins, revealing a tiny, blurred portal to the outside world. The sky is no longer indigo. It has shifted to a pale, ghostly violet. The stars are starting to fade, their light drowned out by the approaching dawn. But the sun will not be visible for another 2 hours. This is the blue hour, the time of the deepest cold and the most profound stillness. You look at the snowdrifts piled against the window. They have grown since you last checked. The wind has sculpted them into sharp architectural ridges, like the fins of some great white sea creature frozen in time. You return to the hearth and take up a small iron poker. You gently stir the embers, not to wake the fire into a flame, but to ensure that the heat is distributed evenly. The coals are so hot that they look translucent, as if you could see through the carbon into the heart of the heat itself. The sound of the iron on the embers is a series of soft, metallic tinks and hisses. You think about the Curie point, a concept far beyond the knowledge of 1284, but one that the Smiths understand intuitively. There is a temperature where iron loses its magnetism, a physical change that signals the metal is ready for the final stages of the forge. In the same way, there is a point of rest for the human mind, a state where the cares of the day lose their pull and the soul becomes ready for the deep forge of sleep. You are approaching that point now. The sword on the table remains motionless, a dark line in the dim light. It has survived the deepest part of the night. The hilt is tight, the The wax is set and the thermal shock of the room has been avoided. It is a successful piece of maintenance, a quiet triumph of understanding over environment. You look at the blade and feel a sense of companionship. Like you, the steel is simply waiting for the spring. It is enduring the cold, holding its shape, and remaining true to its nature despite the harshness of the world. You walk to the corner and take a small sip of cold water from the bucket. The ice has not reformed since you last broke it, a sign that the room's warmth is winning the battle against the exterior chill. The water is refreshing, a liquid clarity that sharpens your senses one last time before you let them go. You return to the bed, the heavy wool blankets inviting you back into their embrace. As you lie down, you listen to the rhythmic, slow breathing of the house. The stones, the wood, the steel, they all seem to be breathing with you. The sound of the fire is a low, comforting murmur, a story told in a language of heat and light. You feel the weight of the sheepskin settling over you, a warm, heavy pressure that anchors you to the earth. Your thoughts become as soft and formless as the falling snow. You are no longer thinking about atoms or lattices or phosphorus. You are simply a part of the stillness. The story of the winter is nearing its conclusion for this night, the pages turning with a slow, silent grace. The dawn is coming, but it is far away. For now, there is only the warmth, the darkness, and the absolute peace of the mountain sanctuary. You close your eyes, the last image in your mind being the soft, orange glow of the embers reflecting on the blade of the sword, a tiny, defiant sun in a world of ice. You are safe. You are warm. And the long, quiet dream of the winter continues its steady, hypnotic unspooling. The world has entered the blue hour, that ethereal liminal space where the night has technically ended, but the sun remains a hidden promise below the jagged horizon of the Pyrenees. Through the small, cleared circle in the frost-laden window, the landscape is rendered in shades of cobalt, slate, and charcoal. The snow does not look white in this light. It looks like a vast, undulating sea of frozen violet. There is a specific quality to the silence at this hour in the year 1284. It is a dense, pressurized silence, the kind that occurs when the air is so cold it seems to have lost the ability to carry sound. Even the distant, morning howl of a wolf, should one occur, would likely be swallowed by the crystalline density of the atmosphere before it could reach these stone walls. Inside, you are awake, but only just. You remain cocooned in the deep, humid warmth of the bed, your body a heat source for the heavy layers of wool and sheepskin. This is the ultimate luxury of the winter, the ability to observe the cold without being consumed by it. You watch the ceiling beams, those massive, smoke-darkened lengths of larch. In the dim, pre-dawn light, the grain of the wood seems to move, the shadows of the dying embers casting long, flickering shapes that dance like slow-motion ghosts across the timber. You follow the line of a single crack in the beam, a check that formed decades ago as the wood dried. It is a reminder that everything, wood, stone, and steel, is in a constant state of internal movement, responding to the invisible forces of the environment. With a slow, rhythmic movement, you slide your legs out from the warmth. The transition is sharp, a momentary shock of cool air against skin that has been insulated for hours. You find your heavy woolen tunic, which you left draped over the foot of the bed. It is thick and coarse, the fibers having been fulled, pounded in water to make the weave tighter and more wind-resistant. As you pull it over your head, the smell of the wool envelopes you, a mixture of lanolin, old wood smoke, and the faint, clean scent of the mountain air. It is the smell of safety. Your first task of the day is the revival of the hearth. During the night, the fire has retreated into a deep, protected core of white ash. You walk to the fireplace, your footsteps muffled by the thick woolen socks. You take up the bellows, a beautiful, utilitarian object made of supple deerskin and 2 paddles of polished oak. The leather is cool to the touch, and as you pull the handles apart, you hear the soft, rhythmic huff of the air being drawn into the chamber. You aim the nozzle of the bellows at the base of the ash mound. You press the handles together with a slow, steady force. Whoosh! A cloud of fine, gray ash rises, swirling in the air like a miniature snowstorm. Beneath the ash, a single, brilliant eye of orange light appears. You pump the bellows again, more rhythmically now. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The sound is hypnotic, a mechanical heartbeat that fills the quiet room. The orange light grows, spreading through the charcoal, turning the dull black into a pulsing, translucent crimson. You add a handful of dry larch shavings. They catch instantly, the thin curls of wood turning black and then erupting into a delicate, dancing yellow flame. The sound is a series of tiny, energetic crackles, snap, pop, sizzle, as the resins in the larch are consumed. You add larger pieces of split ash wood. Ash is the king of winter fuel. It burns steadily, even when slightly damp, and it leaves behind a bed of coals that will hold their heat for hours. As the fire takes hold, the room begins to transform. The blue light of the dawn is pushed back to the windows, replaced by the warm, golden flicker of the flames. Your attention, as it always does, returns to the sword. It has survived the coldest night of the winter without incident. You pick it up, the scabbard feeling heavy and solid in your hand. You draw the blade just a few inches, enough to see the steel. In the light of the new fire, the metal looks like frozen water. You look closely at the grain of the steel. Because this blade was forged from pattern-welded iron, the surface is not a uniform gray. Instead, it is a swirling, topographic map of different carbon contents. There are lines like the ripples on a pond, or the grain of a fine piece of wood. This brings us to the final metallurgical secret of the winter break: grain growth and cold working. When a smith forges a sword, he is essentially managing the size and shape of the iron crystals. If he heats the metal too much for too long, the crystals grow large and coarse. Large crystals make for a brittle sword, even in the summer. A good smith hammers the metal at lower temperatures, a process called packing the edge, to break those large crystals into tiny, microscopic grains. The smaller the grains, the more boundaries there are to stop a crack from spreading. However, in the extreme cold of 1284, the behavior of these grains changes. At the microscopic level, metal deforms through the movement of dislocations, tiny slips in the crystal lattice. In the warmth, these slips can move freely, allowing the metal to bend. But in the sub-zero chill, these dislocations get pinned. They encounter impurities like the phosphorus or slag we discussed, and they stop moving. When the movement stops, the energy of a blow has nowhere to go. It builds up at the grain boundary, until the bond between the crystals simply snaps. It is a silent, invisible drama occurring at the scale of atoms. The sword looks identical to its summer self, but internally it has become a series of locked, unyielding gates. One sharp impact and the gates will shatter. You slide the blade back into its wool-lined scabbard, the sound a soft, comforting shhh tuck. You realize that the preservation of the sword is not just about the wax or the oil. It is about the preservation of its internal peace. By keeping it in the steady, moderate temperature of the room, you are preventing the atoms from entering that state of frustrated, brittle tension. The sun is finally beginning to touch the highest peaks. You can see the transformation through the window. The indigo sky is being flooded with a pale, citrus yellow, and the very tops of the mountains are suddenly tipped with a brilliant, glowing rose. This is the alpenglow, a phenomenon where the light of the sun, still hidden from the valleys, reflects off the ice and snow of the summits. It is a sight of breathtaking, cold beauty. You decide to make a morning infusion. You take a small iron kettle, its surface black and pitted from 1,000 fires, and fill it with the water you broke from the ice earlier. You set it on a trivet over the flames. As the water heats, you prepare the ingredients: a few dried rose hips gathered in the autumn, and a small piece of dried ginger root that came all the way from the spice markets of the Levant, traded through a dozen hands before reaching this mountain outpost. The task of slicing the ginger is a sensory experience. You use your sharp seeks, the blade moving through the tough, fibrous root with a rhythmic tock, tock, tock. The smell is immediate and powerful, a sharp, spicy, and warming aroma that seems to defy the cold of the room. You drop the slices into the water along with the rose hips. As the water begins to simmer, the steam rises, carrying the scent of the ginger and the faint, fruity tartness of the rose hips. The sound of the kettle is a low, rising hum, a liquid vibration that matches the steady roar of the fire. You sit by the hearth and watch the steam. It curls and twists in the air, illuminated by the shafts of morning light that are now beginning to penetrate the room. Each shaft of light is filled with dancing motes of dust, tiny particles of wool and wood and stone that have been suspended in the still air. They look like a galaxy of tiny stars, moving in slow, orbital paths. You take a heavy ceramic mug, thick-walled and glazed in a deep forest green, and pour the infusion. The liquid is a pale amber red. As you hold the mug in both hands, the heat seeps through the clay and into your palms. It is a deep, penetrating warmth that seems to settle into your bones. You take a slow sip. The ginger is sharp and hot on the tongue, followed by the mellow, earthy sweetness of the rose hips. It is a drink designed for the winter, a liquid fuel that wakes up the internal systems of the body. The logistics of the day ahead are simple. You will need to bring in more wood from the outdoor stack, a task that will require you to brave the exterior for a few minutes. You will need to check the roof for the snow load, the weight of the accumulated drifts that can crush even the strongest rafters if left to pile too high. You will need to grind a small amount of rye for the evening's bread. None of these tasks are urgent. None of them are difficult. They are simply the steady, monotonous steps of survival. You look at the walls of your dwelling. The limestone blocks are beautiful in the morning light, their surfaces showing the fossils of ancient sea creatures, tiny, spiraling shells and fragments of coral trapped in the stone for millions of years. This house is built from the remains of an ocean, perched on the top of a mountain, held together by the labor of men and the patience of the winter. It is a profound thought, but one that you hold lightly. In the winter, grand thoughts are less important than the temperature of the pottage or the sharpness of the axe. The fire gives a loud, satisfied crack, a large log of ash splitting down the center as the heat reaches its heart. A shower of sparks dances up the chimney, disappearing into the pale morning sky. The room is now fully light, the golden glow of the fire competing with the white reflected light of the snow outside. You feel a sense of absolute clarity. The night has passed. The sword is safe. The fire is strong. You spend a few minutes simply watching the way the light moves across the floor. It is a slow, geometric progression, the shadows of the window frame stretching and then shortening as the sun climbs higher. You follow the edge of the shadow as it crosses a single knot in the chestnut wood. It takes several minutes for the light to fully traverse the knot, a tiny, silent drama of celestial mechanics played out on the floor of a mountain hut. This is the beauty of the boring life. When the world is stripped of its noise and its conflict, the smallest details become significant. The texture of a stone, the smell of a root, the sound of a bellows, these are the things that make up the fabric of existence. You are not a spectator of the winter. You are a participant in it. You are part of the long, slow rhythm of the mountain, a creature of the hearth and the stone, living in a world that has decided to take its time. As you finish your infusion, you feel a deep physical readiness for the day. The lethargy of the night has been replaced by a calm, steady energy. You stand up and walk to the door, placing your hand on the heavy oak. You can feel the cold on the other side, a vibrant, living force that is waiting for you. But you are prepared. You have the wool, you have the fire, and you have the knowledge of the steel. The story of the winter is nearing its end for now, but the winter itself will continue for many weeks. The snow will fall, the ice will grow, and the atoms of the sword will remain in their cold, locked embrace. But within these walls there is warmth, there is order, and there is the profound, hypnotic peace of a life lived in harmony with the elements. You take a deep breath, the air in the room sweet with the smell of ginger and wood smoke, and you prepare to step out into the white, silent world of the dawn. The sun has finally cleared the jagged, white-capped shoulders of the eastern peaks, and the room is flooded with a light so intense and pure it feels as though the air itself has been rinsed clean. This is the full arrival of the winter day in the year 1284. The light does not bring warmth, but it brings a sharp, clinical clarity to everything it touches. The dust motes that were dancing in the shadows just an hour ago are now suspended in brilliant golden shafts, appearing like a microscopic snowfall frozen in midair. You watch them from your seat by the hearth, fascinated by their slow, orbital drift. They move with a profound lack of urgency, governed by the faint, invisible currents of rising heat from the fire. Each speck is a tiny piece of the world, a fiber of wool, a grain of skin, a microscopic fragment of the mountain stone, all unified in this silent, sunlit ballet. You stand up slowly, feeling the strength in your limbs and the comforting weight of your layered clothing. The final logistical task of this long, quiet sequence is the preparation for a brief excursion to the exterior woodpile. To step outside in 30 degrees below weather is not a simple act. It is a transition that requires the same level of care and preparation as the forging of a blade. You begin with your boots. They are heavy, double-soled things made of bark-tanned cowhide, stiff with the cold but softened by the layers of grease you applied days ago. You slide in the new felt insoles you cut yesterday. They fit perfectly, providing a soft, springy foundation that will trap the heat of your feet against the frozen ground. As you lace the boots with thongs of braided hemp, you focus on the rhythm of the task. Pull, cross, tuck, pull, cross, tuck. The sound of the hemp rubbing against the leather is a dry, fibrous noise, a small percussion in the quiet room. You make sure the tension is even, tight enough to provide support but loose enough to allow the blood to circulate freely. In the extreme cold, circulation is your primary defense. The heart is the forge, and the blood is the heat-carrying medium. If the flow is restricted, the winter's bite will find the extremities in minutes. Next comes the outer cloak, the heavy indigo wool you repaired last night. You drape it over your shoulders and the weight is immediate and reassuring. It feels like a portable wall, a mobile sanctuary of sheep's wool and vegetable dye. You pull the hood up, the fur lining, soft rabbit skin tickling your cheeks. You take your mittens, which are made of boiled wool so thick they are almost as stiff as boards. You have kept them near the hearth so they are warm to the touch. Inside, your fingers find the familiar, cozy pockets of air. This is the final layer of your armor against the elements. Before you reach for the door, you turn to the table and look at the sword one last time. It rests there, encased in its new, wool-lined scabbard, looking as peaceful as any object of stone or wood. In these final moments of our journey together, we must consider the ultimate fate of the steel. We have explored the phosphorus, the slag, the tempering, and the crystal lattices. But the true enemy of the blade in the medieval winter is a concept known to modern science as the ductile-to-brittle transition temperature, or DBTT. Every piece of ferritic steel, the type used for swords for over 1,000 years, has a tipping point. Above this temperature, the metal is a hero. It can absorb shocks, bend under pressure, and return to its shape. Below this temperature, it becomes a villain to its owner. The transition is not always gradual. For many historical steels, the shift from tough to glass-like could happen within a range of just 10 or 20 degrees. On a mild autumn day, the sword is safe. But on a morning like this, when the temperature has plummeted into the deep negatives, the metal has crossed that invisible boundary. It has entered the lower shelf of energy absorption. The atoms in the iron lattice have lost their ability to move in response to a strike. In the summer, if the sword hits a shield, the energy travels through the blade as a wave of atomic slippage. In the winter, that energy cannot travel. It piles up at the point of impact, creating a massive, localized pressure that the brittle bonds between the crystals simply cannot sustain. The sword breaks because it has lost the ability to communicate with itself. It has become a collection of independent crystals rather than a unified whole. This is the great silence of the steel, the moment where the cold triumphs over the fire of the forge. You pick up the sword and belt it around your waist. The weight hangs comfortably against your hip, the leather strap creaking softly as it takes the load. You do not intend to use the blade today, but in the wilderness of 1284, the sword is a part of your dress, a symbol of your readiness and your place in the world. Even if it is brittle, even if it is vulnerable, it is yours. You walk to the door and place your hand on the heavy iron latch. You can feel the cold radiating through the metal, even through your thick mittens. You take a deep breath, filling your lungs with the warm, wood-scented air of the room, and then you lift the latch. The sound is a solid, mechanical clack-chink. You pull the door open, and for a moment the world is nothing but white light and a silence so sharp it feels like a physical sensation. The cold hits you, but it doesn't penetrate. Your layers hold. The snow is piled high, a wall of crystalline powder that has drifted against the stones. You step out, and the sound of your boot hitting the snow is the most iconic ASMR trigger of the winter. A deep, rhythmic, and incredibly satisfying crunch squeak. Crunch squeak. Crunch squeak. The snow is so cold that the individual crystals are not melting under your weight. They are fracturing, thousands of tiny, hexagonal structures snapping at once. It is a dry, musical sound, like walking on a field of microscopic glass. You walk toward the woodpile, which is located just 20 paces from the door. Each step is a deliberate act of navigation. You look at the world around you. The sky is a hard, polished turquoise without a single cloud to break the expanse. The pine trees are so heavily burdened with snow that their branches bow toward the earth, looking like white-robed monks in prayer. There is no wind. The air is perfectly, unnervingly still. You can see the individual flakes of frost suspended in the air, glinting like diamonds in the sun. This is the diamond dust of the high altitudes, moisture that has frozen directly out of the air without forming a cloud. You reach the woodpile and begin the task of selecting the evening's fuel. You pick up a log of oak, the wood feeling like a block of ice in your hands. You knock it against another log to clear the snow, and the sound is a short, sharp clack. It doesn't ring. The wood is too frozen for that. You stack 4, 5, 6 logs into the crook of your arm, feeling the familiar, heavy pressure against your chest. The smell of the frozen wood is faint. A clean, sharp, ozonic scent that is entirely different from the smell of the wood when it is burning. As you turn to head back to the safety of the house, you pause. You look out over the valley which stretches away below your outpost. You can see the frozen river, a winding ribbon of silver gray, and the dark, bristling tops of the forest. The world is vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent. It is a machine of ice and light, operating on a scale that makes the human life seem like a fleeting spark. But then you feel the warmth of your own breath inside your hood. You feel the sturdiness of your boots and the security of the sword at your side. You are a small part of this machine, a deliberate and maintained element of the winter landscape. You walk back to the door, the crunch squeak of your footsteps marking your progress. You step over the threshold and close the door behind you. The transition back into the warmth is an explosion of sensory relief. The air in the room feels thick, sweet, and incredibly heavy. You can feel the moisture returning to your skin, the frost on your hood beginning to melt into tiny, glistening droplets. You set the wood down by the hearth with a series of solid, woody thuds. You move to the table and unbelt the sword. You lay it back in its accustomed place. The blade is cold, but the wool lining of the scabbard will ensure that it warms up slowly, avoiding the thermal shock we discussed. You have done your duty by the steel. You have respected its nature, understood its weaknesses, and provided for its maintenance. In return, the sword provides you with a sense of continuity, a link to the long history of human craftsmanship and survival. The fire is burning brightly now, the ash wood providing a steady, cheering roar. You take off your cloak and mittens, the heat of the room embracing you like an old friend. You sit back in your heavy chair, the sheepskin soft and welcoming. The morning's work is done. The logistics are secure. The fire is fed. The world outside will continue its frozen cycle, the sun climbing and then falling, the snow accumulating and then settling. But here, within these walls, there is a perfect, monotonous peace. You look at the sword one last time. It reflects the orange glow of the fire, the pattern-welded lines shimmering like the surface of a dark, slow-moving river. You think about the atoms inside, the iron and carbon, and even the troublesome phosphorus, all settled into their winter state. They are waiting. And you too are waiting. There is no hurry for the spring. The winter has its own rewards, the clarity of the light, the depth of the silence, and the profound satisfaction of a well-maintained life. Your eyes begin to grow heavy. The rhythm of the fire, the scent of the wood smoke, and the absolute safety of your sanctuary are pulling you back toward the soft, formless depths of rest. The story of the sword and the cold has reached its natural conclusion. It is a story without conflict, a story of atoms and energy, of maintenance and patience. It is a boring story, and that is its greatest strength. It is a story that invites you to let go, to trust in the walls and the wool, and to sink into the long, white dream of the mountain night. The light in the room is golden, the fire is steady, the world is quiet. You close your eyes, the last sound you hear being the soft, rhythmic hiss of a single log as it surrenders its heart to the flame. You are safe. You are warm. You are at peace. The end.